In this video, we'll explore the book of Deuteronomy. You see the subtitle, Moses' Parting Exhortations, indicating that this is a speech. It's not so much a record of events as it is the delivery of a considered speech. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Where this takes place geographically is across the Jordan River from Jericho. You see Jericho there towards the top of the Dead Sea, and across the river then would be the area of Shittim, and it's in that territory that we are introduced to the scene of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy conveys, the meaning of the title conveys the idea of a second law, nomos being Greek for law, deutero meaning second. This arises from something of a mistranslation when the Hebrew was converted into Greek at the point of Deuteronomy 17:18. That's the passage where the king, when eventually there will be a monarchy in Israel, the king is instructed to make a copy of this law. Copy came out in the Greek as a repetition, and that wound up being translated as deuteronomos, a second law. In contrast, the Hebrew title, as is characteristic of so many books of the Hebrew Bible, particularly the Pentateuch, the Hebrew title arises from the initial words of the book. These are the words, Ele HaDevarim, which yields the shortened title in Hebrew, Devarim, or HaDevarim, the words. And that's appropriate since it is the words that Moses declared in this speech. As we read the book of Deuteronomy, as you've read it, I'm sure you've realized that there is a great deal of the content which we've already met before. In fact, as one student suggested to me in class today, the comment was, well, haven't I already read this? Is this simply a cut and paste from an earlier presentation? As we read the book more thoroughly and understand the setting, we come to realize that what's going on is the nation of Israel is at a unique junction in its history. Think of where they've come from. Most recently, this group constituted the slaves in Egypt, miraculously rescued by God, carried to Mount Sinai, engaged with God through the covenant, led from there to the southern edge of Canaan with an opening opportunity to enter the promised land. That failed because of their lack of faith. And then they wander for 40 years. Towards the end of that, making their way up the Transjordan, bypassing certain nations of which God says, don't bother them. They are entitled to the land where they live. And then tangling with other nations who oppose them, of which God says, yes, if they oppose you, you are authorized to counter them militarily and defeat them, which they do, particularly Sihon and Og, over in the northern section of the Transjordan there to the east of the Sea of Galilee. And then they make their way down the Transjordan, down the valley, to the northern edge of the Dead Sea, this location Shittim, and they are about to cross over into the gateway city of Jericho and then up the Judean hills into the land that God has promised to give them. This is a crucial point. It's crucial then in terms of where they are about to go. It is also crucial in terms of the fact that we have a new population. This population is the remnant of those age 19 and younger at the point of the Kadesh Barnea failure to enter the promised land. Consequently, as a younger population, they need to have the guidelines and the terms of the covenant clarified and put clearly before them once again before they move into the territory. And there's also the issue of the fact that there's going to be a transition in leadership. Moses will soon come to the end of his life, and his leadership will be replaced by Joshua. So let's look at those three just in summary form. It's appropriate for this rehearsal then in the Transjordan, rehearsal of the covenant, rehearsal of the stipulations of what it means to be God's people. Because as they move into this new land, there are going to be distractions, influences of prosperity, and influences of competing theology from the population already there. The generation is young and new. They were not adults, at least of military age, at the time of the Sinai covenant. And we have this transition in leadership from Moses to Joshua at the end of the book. If I were to try to compress these some 34 chapters into one statement, here is the sentence that I've crafted. Perhaps you can improve on it, but it'll at least put before us several of the components that drive and describe this particular book. An aging leader exhorts a new generation at the edge of a new land, exhorting them to abandon all in decisive, loving service of the one true God. An aging leader, that's Moses. He's at the end of his ministry. He is exhorting. I hope as you have read the book of Deuteronomy, you have picked up on the power of the delivery of this particular book. Unlike the narratives of Genesis, which are powerful in their plot, and similarly in Exodus, the powerful events that are described, we have here someone who is preaching, basically. He is speaking to convince. He is speaking with an urgency, in some ways you might say a desperation. And he uses rhetorical devices. He uses illustrations from past experiences of the people in order to propel his message into their minds, to convince them to act faithfully and to behave as the covenant people of God in a dependable fashion in the new land. So, exhortation. It is a new generation, as we've just commented. This is following the 40 years of wilderness. They're at the edge of this new land. Pretty soon they're going to be in a different environment. Instead of wandering, they're going to start settle. And he is urging them to abandon everything, to devote themselves singly. And that service to God should be of a loving sort. And here we're thinking of Deuteronomy 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. So it should be a loving service, not just a duty driven with a sort of trepidation, scared of punishments that might come on them. And the one that they are devoting themselves to is the true God, who alone is God. And here we're tapping into the fact that Deuteronomy, perhaps more so than any other book of the Bible, makes it crystal clear that the way God presents himself and identifies himself is as a singular God, monotheism. Monotheism comes through more clearly from the book of Deuteronomy than perhaps any other book of the Hebrew Bible. So once again, we have here in this book an aging leader exhorting a new generation at the edge of this new land, exhorting them to abandon all in a decisive, I didn't comment on that earlier. There are places where he says, choose life. I set before you life and death. Now choose. Make a decisive movement. And that should be loving service of the one true God. Let's give our attention now to elements of the literary context of this book. Earlier, I remarked that this book is not simply a description of events or the delivery of instructions and laws, but it's sermonic, it's exhorting, it's powerfully rhetorical in its style. The writer Tigay, in his commentary, indicates the following. He says, the most notable feature of Deuteronomy's style is its exhortatory, didactic, sermonic character. Whether recalling past events, presenting theological arguments, or proclaiming laws, Moses' style is not that of the historical narrative, theological treatise, or legal code. So just as an aside, it has those elements, narrative, theological treatise, or legal code, but that's in itself not the dominant style. Tigay continues, he, that is Moses, constantly goes beyond the immediate subject to point out its religious and ethical implications and to appeal for faith and obedience. Notice that. Faith and obedience. He's appealing. He's trying to draw people to a decision. Already I've commented on the exhortation, choose life, that arises from chapter 30, verses 19 and 20. This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. Here's another one from Deuteronomy 10, beginning with verse 12. And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, walk in his ways, love him, serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Observe the Lord's commandments and decrees I'm giving you today for your own good. So it's sermonic in style. It lands on our ears and on our minds as an exhortation. Next, we want to be aware of how Moses in the book of Deuteronomy makes use of story as history and as illustration. As history and illustration. So, for example, in chapter 4, we find mention of the fact that the Israelites met with God at Sinai. And in particular, chapter 4, verse 9 and following, he mentions that at that Sinai encounter, God was invisible. Here you see that passage displayed. We're looking at Deuteronomy chapter 4. Draw your attention, please, to verse 12 then and following. The Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sound of words. You heard, notice this, auditory experience. You heard the sound of words, but visually now, you saw no form. And then to emphasize it, he goes back and says, there was only a voice. So there was a content-filled communication, namely declaring a covenant, which he charged you to observe, stipulations for behavior, 10 commandments, wrote them on 2 tablets. So there's verbal communication. But notice what he does with that. On the one hand, he says there are things that you need to do, right? God declared it. So from this illustration in past history, Moses extracts the fact that there are things that Israel is responsible for doing because God said to do these things. But notice what also he says, since you saw no form, when the Lord spoke, there's the auditory, to you at Horeb, that's another name for Mount Sinai, out of the fire. Now this, take care. Watch yourselves closely so that you do not act corruptly by making an idol for yourselves in the form of any figure, likeness of male and female and so on, winged bird, things that creep, fish of the sea, things that you may find in the heavens, the sun and the moon, and so forth. What we want to take away from this is how the illustration, the excerpt from past history, served the current sermonic objective. The sermonic objective is people be devoted to God, and there's only one God, and it is completely inappropriate to try and augment your worship and devotion of that one God by fashioning some physical comparison, a likeness, an image, a statue, and worshiping that statue. That is just totally inappropriate. And here's why, and this is how the illustration functions. Because at that one time in your history which you remember, now those of you that are adults in Moses' audience, and you would remember back at Sinai in that dreadful, terrifying time of the powerful display of God when Moses, went up on the mountain and brought back the Ten Commandments. You remember at that time you heard the sound of his voice, but at that time of most unmistakable connection with God, he did not show you any visual shape. So for goodness sake, don't get it into your silly minds now to suppose that you know what he looks like and consequently chisel out of wood or out of stone or fashion as a cast idol, fashion anything that you would think or like to tell others that God looks like this, and consequently that object deserves worship. Don't do that. Here's why: because of the illustration from past experience when the Israelite people were unmistakably in God's presence. Let's turn our attention to Deuteronomy 9 for another situation where we can see Moses drawing on past experiences in the life of Israel in order to make a point of how they should be responding to God now, what attitude they should embrace. In chapter 9, he's going to be talking about how Israel responded with the golden calf rebellion. Before he gets to that, here is the point he's making. When the Lord your God thrusts them, that's the current residents of Palestine, thrust them out before you, do not say to yourself, it's because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me into this land. So the counsel is against a sense of spiritual arrogance. Don't get that into your head. Instead, Moses explains, here's why you're getting to live there. It's because of the wickedness of these nations, the current residents. And this reinforces what we saw back in Genesis 15 when God said to Abraham, the sin of the Amorites, current residents in Palestine, has not yet come to its full mark. And when it does, then God's going to dispossess them and move in Abraham's descendants. So once again, this passage is a caution against spiritual arrogance. He says it again in verse 6. Not because of your righteousness. And then will come some illustrations of past rebellion to remind them that they are not so very righteous, that they are just totally dependent on God's mercy. So he says, don't forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath. God got very, very upset with you for good reason in the wilderness. Even at Horeb, Mount Sinai, you provoked the Lord to wrath. And that would have to do with the golden calf down here. They have been quick to turn away from the way I commanded them. They have cast an image for themselves. This is God's report to Moses still up on the mountain. They are a stubborn people, says God concerning Israel. So once again, past story to drive home the point that they should not grow arrogant when they get into the promised land, thinking that they have somehow earned it and God owes it to them. Moses says, absolutely not. You're getting something you don't deserve. It's only because the current residents have misbehaved for a long sustained period that their lease has run out and God is moving you in. He will go on here, still in Deuteronomy 9, to mention other illustrations from their past history, their story, where Israel behaved in a rebellious fashion so as to incur God's wrath. Tabera, Masa, Kibrot Ta'ava. Look at this, just one after another. It's almost to say we have an unending list, a list as long as your arm of times. And even Kadesh Barnea, there we go. That's the failure to move in with courage in God, faith in God, into Canaan. So again, the point is the use illustratively of past experience in Israel's history, in order to drive home a sermonic point. The point in this case you should revere God and behave with humility. It occurs to me that a few verses down here in chapter 10, he's going to emphasize that. He's wrapping up reminder comments about 40 days and nights. The Lord was unwilling to destroy you, the sense of you deserved it, but God said, God agreed not to. And now, Israel, what should you do about this? What does God expect? Fear the Lord your God, and fear we want to understand here as hold in high regard. Not primarily a sense of being afraid of God, although we shouldn't divorce from the notion of fearing God, the notion of being afraid if, in fact, we are set against him in opposition, then we better be afraid. But the first edges of fear here, the primary and preliminary edges of fear that are intended here are revere, treat with high regard. One of my professors in graduate school said, this means fundamentally take God seriously. To fear God is to take him seriously, to not treat him flippantly or with disregard. And walk in his ways, so be obedient to what he says and love him. That is not an attitude that's driven by being petrified of him, is it? Serving him totally, all heart, all soul, and so on. So it's to this end that the previous accounts from history are employed by the preacher, the exhorter, the rhetorician, Moses. As we are aware of this important concept, Moses employing history illustratively to drive home a point, it will change how we read Deuteronomy. Instead of encountering these stories and saying to ourselves, haven't I read this before? Why am I hearing it again? We will ask more carefully that question, why am I hearing it again? Moses, why are you saying this here? What point are you trying to drive home? Then we'll listen for the point. We'll let the story become the fuel, the propulsion that drives the point home, and then we will look for the ways in which that point should drive home to us in our relationship with God today. Literary context, as far as styles, within the book of Deuteronomy, we want to be very aware of legal content. Chapters 12 to 26 are chock full of legal content. That is to say, behavior exhorted by God or prohibited by God for people in covenant relationship with him. We'll come back to this a little bit later. We'll break the Deuteronomy lecture at this point, having wrapped up literary context. In the next, we'll address historical context.